Yo, I'm Owl. Most of you will know me as just a ranked player. Some of you may know me as a Monarch Stack team member, back when that was a team. And some of you will just know me as a coach. Today, I'm going to be taking on the role of none of those three things, and I'm going to be doing some judging in the form of a tier list for the ranked players on the NA leaderboard. Now, I'm far from the first person to make a tier list like this, but the reason I'm giving it a go for myself is, well, I think it's fun, and also because I think I can add a little educational twist so that the players on the list can learn how they can improve to get their placement increased. And I want to add a quick disclaimer or a warning. Do not form your opinion entirely based on my tier list. Furthermore, do not go after or at all antagonize anybody placed on the tier list. Do not use what I say in this video or the contents of the tier list to belittle others. If you disagree with me or have any problems, leave it in my comment section and my comment section only. And if you are a player featured on the tier list and you would like to make any comments, you are absolutely welcome to do so, and I will heart them so everybody can see your perspective. This isn't a super serious thing, it's just for fun and to hopefully provide my own perspective to some players who might need it for improvement. I am not the police, it is not my job or my right to ostracize people for their skill level. I'm very opposed to doing that, and I actively promote improvement for myself and others through coaching and community discussion. Thank you, enjoy. So one more thing before we start is that a lot of these players might be renamed. I will try my best to call them by what most people will know them as. Starting with this first player here, who is Kier, as far as I'm aware. Kier is a very, very strong mechanical player. He has some decent flexibility in terms of the characters he will play. And he does occasionally calm, just given his mechanics and flexibility, regardless of his communication. I think he very easily warrants S tier. Next up is Grustle King. Another very good mechanical player with some decent character flexibility, and also somebody who I do believe calms quite a bit and very much plays to win. I think it's a very justified S tier for him as well. Next, we have Mallory. Mallory is going to be the first one who I do not give S tier here. A lot of people fear him for his mechanics, and that's understandable, but as his name implies here, he's a very, very selfish player. He will almost only pick damage farming characters, quote unquote damage farming characters. And while he does very good on those characters, he gets lots of damage. Simply not being able to play supports or play fill in any capacity based on the criteria that I have set for this list, it will bump you down a notch. But admittedly, he does have very strong mechanics. TQRD. This one I'm a bit wishy-washy about, especially given where I'll be putting some other players later on in the video. So I'm just going to put him at C for now. They're somewhat flexible in characters. They do communicate more than most people in this game, unfortunately. However, they're just not very strong mechanically, and I don't believe their game sense is quite up to par. But there are definitely worse players you could have on your team, and as a result, we'll be reserving the D tier for those and giving a C tier to TQRD. Nakirigumi. I don't know too much about them. I know they're a pretty strong mechanical player. Their game sense is decent as well. I don't think they're the most flexible in what they play, but they're pretty good at the characters that they do play, and they play characters that are very important, such as, Ming Flavia. With that being said, I don't think they communicate very much. However, having them on your team is most likely going to be a boon. Hedbin. Hedbin is literally John Smurf. He has 9 billion alt accounts. I don't even know if he has an actual main account. Given that fact, it's a little bit hard to determine his skill, because most of the time he's punching down. But I do think they're very strong mechanically. They definitely will humble you in gunfights, but they don't really communicate, and it's hard to exactly judge them for their game sense, given they play in a lower elo than they're meant to. So, given that, I'll put them in A tier. Most likely, if you have Headman on your team, they are not going to be anywhere close to the bottom of the leaderboard, same as anybody else in A tier, but they might not always be the biggest team player you could get on your team. So, A tier. Pooge. Pooge has been a really long time DMR player from my understanding, and simply for that reason, I don't think I can ever put them in S tier. But I do think they make A tier very comfortably. Very good mechanics. They know how to play their characters well, and typically their characters are in high demand for your team comp. Flawed. Flawed I don't know too much about. I think they're pretty decent mechanically. I don't know if their game sense is entirely there, and sometimes I see them on some very selfish picks, but definitely above TQRD definitely makes B tier. I'm not sure I would put them as high as somebody like Headbin or Nakirogumi. Banes. I think Banes is a pretty flexible player, but I don't think they play any of their characters particularly well. I believe they used to be a sniper main, and they never showed the best mechanics when they were playing sniper. It could be slightly different now, but given their mechanics, I will put them a little bit lower. Having said that, I do think they're a decent asset on your team because they do play a very large variety of characters. Um, but I don't think they communicate very much, so it's going to be limited to C tier, unfortunately. Senagog. I don't think this player needs any explanation. Everybody knows who he is. Incredible mechanical player, probably the best in the game. Plays some very, very strong characters and plays them very, very well. Communicates with his team more often than not, and he will always be at the top of the leaderboard. S tier. Zophai. Another really good mechanical player. Uh, Lately, I've been hearing them communicate a lot in ranks. I don't think they always did, but lately they've been communicating a lot more, and they always play their characters very well. I don't think they're horrifically flexible. I think they mostly play Duelist, but they're very, very good at Duelist. They have great game sense and really good mechanics. I think they land in S tier quite comfortably. Hi. This might come as a surprise to a lot of you who would probably place him very comfortably in S along with Zophai, Gressel King, etc. But I don't think he's quite as good mechanically as anybody in S tier. I think he can hold his own in A tier though. I think his game sense is decent. His character picks aren't terribly flexible, and I don't hear him communicating that much. His mechanics do generally allow him to hold his own in higher elo matches. So, A tier. Vi. Vi is a pretty flexible player, but they don't have the best mechanics or game sense. However, they do communicate quite a bit, so I'll put them in B tier. Is a pretty decent player. I think they started out as a sniper main and recently transitioned more towards DMR, uh, which definitely gives them some more points in my books because DMRs are typically less harmful to your team comp. Having said that, I don't think they're mechanically their strongest. I think their game sense is passable, and I'm not sure if they communicate or not, but simply given the mechanics and lack of flexibility, to my understanding, I will be placing them in B tier. Magic, some people know them as Shiroe, pretty strong mechanically. I can't comment too much on their game sense. I think they calm a little bit, but not too much. Having said that, I think they can easily swing the A tier, just for their mechanics. Asane. Some people pronounce this Asini, and I think that's very silly. Very, very long time player. I've seen him since the betas, and he has always been a sniper main since the dawn of time. And he is very, very strong on sniper. I think he's a lot less mechanically oppressive than somebody like Keto, who we're about to rate next. But I think they play a very, very strong support on their sniper, and they're still very easily top 5 snipers in the game, despite probably not being the best of them mechanically. S tier for sure. Keto. This is the only player in the game who can selfishly pick sniper every match, and you can never get mad at them for it because they are simply so good mechanically that they make it work. They also communicate a lot, which I believe Asane does as well. I didn't mention that, but that's another reason Asane is an S tier along with Keto. These players both communicate a lot. They're both very, very mechanically gifted, especially Keto, and both of them have very strong game sense. So these two sniper players are the ones to fear. Okay, so I went to rate the next few players and I realized that I kind of need another tier. So I'm going to add one in between A and B, and then we'll carry on. Okay, now we have a F tier and everybody else has been adjusted accordingly. So with our new tier, it's pretty obvious where our next player is going to be going. Venikin, I think, is a pretty decent player all around. Not very strong mechanically, but they do play mostly support quite flexibly, and they do communicate quite a lot. I think their game sense is decent as well. Mostly just held back by their mechanics, which is why they don't make A tier, but I think it's a pretty fair B tier. Next up is Aqua. Unfortunately, I think Aqua's mechanics hold him back quite aggressively. I don't think he has the worst game sense. I think he understands the game well enough. And he does try to work with his team and communicate. So for that reason alone, I think I can justify top of C. But his mechanics simply prevent him from going any higher, unfortunately. Next up is Cozy. The only reason Cozy gets a lower place than somebody like Mallory, even though they're quite similar mechanically, I think Mallory's a bit better. But the only reason Cozy gets placed lower is because he will literally only play Audrey, whereas Mallory will sometimes play a character like Ming, or I think Flavia as well. On top of that, I think Cozy's game sense is genuinely non-existent, whereas Mallory at least knows what map he's on, so I can't put Cozy any higher than B tier. Dr. Putis, the pioneer of the flamethrower. This one's kind of hard to rank because I think they are decent mechanically, not the best, not the worst. They do communicate a lot with their team, but they almost exclusively play sniper, as far as I'm aware. This could have changed by now, but given that they only play sniper and they're not the best mechanically, it's going to hold them back from the higher tiers for sure. They easily make at least top of B. I don't know that I can comfortably put them in A just given their mechanics. Next up is FS. They used to be almost exclusively a DMR player way back in the day, I believe, but nowadays they've branched out and play, duelist and probably the occasional support. Very strong mechanically. I'm not sure if they communicate. I don't really get them on my team that often. I'm gonna assume they do to some extent, but for their mechanics alone and their relatively decent flexibility, they can definitely make A tier. One thing I should make note of real quick is that these aren't necessarily super ordered. Sometimes I'll say, yeah, maybe this player is top of B, but that doesn't necessarily mean that all of these players are placed in order of how close they are to the tier above or below. With that in mind, let's move on to Emiya. Emiya is known for playing Galatea, and unfortunately, I'm going to be a bit brutal with this one. I don't think there are any good Galatea players in the game. I think basically nobody, not even, big names like Kierce, play her at all at their full potential. And most of the time, they simply get overzealous and get punished for it. The worst thing you can do as Galatea is die first in your team. And unfortunately, I see it happen all too often from players like Emiya and Kierce. So for that alone, being a one trick essentially, and unfortunately not being the best at executing the one trick, I'm going to have to place them quite low. I think they do communicate with their team quite decently, and their game sense is decent enough. Mechanically, kind of just average, but the main thing holding them back is definitely their one trick tendencies. Next up is May. May is a very, very strong duelist player. I think it's basically all they play is duelist. But they are very good mechanically. They communicate with their team a lot. And their game sense is definitely up there, at least in terms of independency. I don't know if they're necessarily the best IGL or whatnot, but they definitely know how to maneuver the map and path well, etc. Combine that with being very strong mechanically and communicating with your team a lot, I think they make the S tier quite comfortably. Next up, Benjip Joff. One of the OG content creators for Strinova, I would say. They play quite flexibly. I believe they communicate with their team. They definitely used to. I don't know if they still do as much nowadays. They're not the best mechanically. They're just okay. Probably better than most people in B tier though. Combine that with their flexibility and willingness to communicate, I think I can swing them in A, even if they're not topping the leaderboards in most of their matches. Next up is Slug Killer, Sluggy, Slugster. We'll just call him Slug. Slug's a pretty decent player mechanically. He's definitely not approaching A tier in that regard alone. He is somewhat flexible, but I don't think he plays his characters particularly well. And he does communicate relatively often. I don't know if I'd place him below somebody like Emiya, but I definitely wouldn't place him above somebody like Venikin. I'm going to put him bottom of B tier because I do think he's at least mechanically stronger than somebody like Aqua. And I'll extend the same courtesy to because I do think he's mechanically stronger than these players while still communicating equally. Next up is Big P, as his chat likes to call him, Pleshy. Pretty much exclusively plays Ming and Flavia, but they play them quite well, and their game sense is definitely above average. They do communicate a lot, not always in the kindest manner, but that's not what this tier list is about. What matters is that, they do communicate. However, their mechanics leave some things to be desired. I think they're pretty good at the mechanics of Strinova, such as movement and weapon handling, but their aim is nowhere near as good as players in S tier, and for that reason, I will be putting him in A. Next up is I Devil Me, or Kawhi, as some people know him. I think a pretty flexible player. He plays some niche characters decently well. I don't think they're the worst mechanically. I don't think they're particularly standout mechanically. I don't know if they communicate very much. Maybe a little bit. I've heard them communicate, and their game sense, I can't really say whether it's bad or good. I definitely think they're tier above players like Cozy or Slug Killer, so somewhere in A tier. Maximi, the modern day Putis, the successor of the Flame. Maximi's a exclusive sniper player. I don't think I've ever seen them on anything else. More accurately, they're actually an exclusive flamethrower user because they don't use their primary. Um, that being said, I think they communicate a little bit. I don't think their game sense is particularly impressive. I don't think their mechanics are particularly impressive. They're probably a much worse sniper than Putis. I don't know if they would really compete in the B tier. I'm going to have to place them in C, unfortunately. I think they definitely could be placed a bit higher if they played more flexible characters, but given they're a one trick and they're not particularly impressive at their one trick, and they don't have the best game sense and minimal communication, it's going to have to be C tier. And now, Gaia. Gaia is probably a name that triggers Winter Soldier episodes and some of the people that hear this name, and reasonably so. They are not very strong mechanically, they are very poor in their game sense, and they almost always pick selfish characters without ever communicating to the team. So they are basically bringing nothing to your team, and for that reason, it's going to have to be a tragic F tier. Next up, Koala the Bear. This player has had a bit of a glow up, I would say. Back in the earlier seasons, they were definitely not the most impressive player, especially because I think they are and have always been a duelist player. I think they've gotten a little bit better, and I think they're a pretty respectable middle of the pack duelist. This placement could be quite a bit off, as well as pretty much all of the placements on here, to be fair, as they're based entirely on my own experience and how good I think they are at their characters. I'm not the authority on these things. All I know is how I've seen them perform statistically in matches I've played with them, as well as what characters they've played and how well I believe they've played them. So take it all with a grain of salt, of course. It's based off my experience and my personal values. If you disagree, that's fine. Having said that, I do think Koala the Bear is a decent duelist player that usually doesn't perform too bad, but typically doesn't perform amazing. Next up is Blexus. They don't really play this game that much, but I can easily say that they are one of the better fill players in the game. Very good mechanically on top of that, and they do communicate. I think their game sense is also quite strong. It's no surprise to most people that this is a very easy S tier. Next up is Bobby, otherwise known as Goon to Emya, because, most normal Strinova username. Bobby is a decent player. He really got his start a couple seasons ago playing Audrey a lot, and he's decent mechanically, but I don't think his game sense is all there. He does communicate, and lately he has been branching out his character choices a little bit. I think he can make the A tier. Next up is Monkey, I believe is how it's intended to be pronounced, and they're mostly a DMR and duelist player, and they're pretty consistent. They're not the worst, they're not the best mechanically. I can't say much about their game sense, and they don't communicate at all, I believe. Just given the lack of communication, I'm gonna have to put them in B tier. If they communicated, that might justify A tier for them, but they're a pretty consistent player and can easily make the B tier. Next up is Tala, mostly a duelist player from my understanding, and I think they play those characters decently well, but I don't think they communicate, and their game sense isn't particularly impressive. So they're basically just A tier off of their mechanics, but I think their mechanics are good enough to justify that. Next up is a player I know as Artemis. I honestly don't know too well what they play. I've mostly seen them on Sniper in my games, and they do communicate a lot, and I think they play their characters pretty decently well. I don't think they're the most impressive mechanically, but I do think they play very team oriented, similar to a player like Asane. Granted, their mechanics aren't anywhere near that level. So I will put them in A tier despite being what I believe to be somewhat of a one trick, because I think they play very selflessly. Hey, post tier list owl here. I want to make a quick amendment. Artemis actually plays a wider variety of character, not just sniper. In fact, it's not even their main. So I just came here to add that information really quick. Back to the tier list. Next up is Takina. Fun fact, one of the oldest Strinova players. That's not really stopping him though. I think he's pretty good mechanically. Unfortunately, he is somewhat of a one trick. I don't think he one tricks quite as hard as he used to, but he mostly plays sniper even now, I believe. He's just not quite at the level of mechanics for S tier, but he probably does easily outrank someone like Dr. Putis. So we'll give him A tier. Next up is Oof. I really don't know much about this player. I see them playing characters like Duelist and long range characters like Audrey or whatnot, and typically they do a lot of damage. So I'm gonna just have to place them based off their mechanics alone, pretty much, and I think they can make A tier simply from that. Next up is Dark Knight 9. I think this player usually picks very selfishly, mostly duelists. I think a lot of like off meta duelists like Ica. I think they're just okay all around, like mechanically okay. Probably not the greatest game sense, and I don't think they communicate at all. But somehow they tend to perform decent on your team. And just given that consistency, I think I can put them in B tier. Next up is King. This is another player I don't really know very much about. I have only really seen them recently, and I don't know if they are particularly high elo or not. I could be mistaken, but I do see them play a lot of Duelist, and they play pretty decent on Duelist. Not exactly the most impressive thing I've ever seen. Nowhere near the tier of somebody like Plushy or FS, but I think they can make B tier. Next up is Galagu, and I touched on this a little bit earlier, but I got to dock a lot of points for being a one trick. However, they've been straying away from the one trick a little bit lately, as far as I can tell, and they're decent mechanically. I think they have good game sense, and they communicate a lot. So pretty simple A tier in my opinion. Next up, Six Wishes. They communicate. I think they play a pretty decent amount of roster. I think they play their roster decently well, but their game sense isn't the best, and mechanically they're not particularly impressive. I think it's a pretty easy B tier for me. Maybe A tier just given the fact that they communicate. However, we'll settle on B tier for now. Next up, Nasho. I think this person exclusively plays support characters, mostly Celestia. I think I've seen them on Lawing. I don't think they communicate at all. I can't say much for their game sense since they usually kind of just follow their duelist, but that kind of works in their favor given their character selection. I don't think they're very strong mechanically, but they are very consistent and they do know how to play their role quite well. And for that, it's hard for me to place them lower than C tier. Next up, B Bushy. I think a relatively flexible player. They definitely communicate. Um, I can't say their game sense is particularly great or poor. And their mechanics often leave a lot to be desired. However, they are flexible and they do communicate. So I can definitely see them making the B tier. Next up is Jod. I think he's a pretty similar player to FS in terms of character picks. Mostly DMR and the occasional duelist. I don't know if he communicates very much. I think he communicates a little bit, but he's pretty strong mechanically and definitely has more game sense than somebody like Cozy, albeit still not a bunch. But just based on that alone, I will put him on A tier. Next up is 9, Speeding 9. He really does not play a lot, but he is definitely decent mechanically and plays a pretty wide variety of characters. Definitely communicates, and I think he has decent game sense. All around, pretty solid and definitely justified in the A tier. Next up is myself, Owl. It's going to be very hard to rank myself without massively over or underestimating myself, but I'll try, and I'll try and inform you so you can make your own decision here. I play almost every single character in the game, and some of them I play at a pretty decent level. I'm mechanically quite decent, definitely above average in this game. I don't communicate as much as I used to, but I still try to. And my game sense is pretty decent. Given that kind of well-roundedness, I think I can make A tier. I don't think I'm mechanically as strong as anybody in S tier, and for that reason, I'm going to keep myself right down here in A tier. But let me know what you think. Do I have a massive ego, or am I selling myself short? Moving on to Enic, I believe is how his name is pronounced. The duo of Slug Killer. I think he plays a decent variety of characters, but I don't think he plays any of them particularly well. I think it's mostly his mechanics holding him back. I can't exactly say his game sense is terrible, and he does communicate. I think it's a pretty straightforward B tier for him. Next up is Chi, primarily a duelist player, I think, but also plays some other stuff. Definitely not a one trick on duelist by any means. Decent mechanically, probably not the best in terms of game sense. Don't know if they really communicate at all, maybe a little bit. I don't think they're strong enough mechanically or well-rounded enough to make the A tier, but I do think they can make the B tier quite comfortably. Waste of money. A pretty flexible player. I think they mostly play controller, characters like Meredith, but I don't think they communicate at all. Maybe okay in the game sense regard. Definitely a better player than somebody like Maxme, simply for their flexibility and higher value character picks, but I don't think they're that strong mechanically, or really that strong all around. But it's as I said, Maxme would be a higher tier if he wasn't a one trick. So keep that in mind. Moving on to good tech. Good Tech is, I think, exclusively a DMR player, but I think he plays all of the DMRs. I think he plays them quite well. I think he's mechanically pretty strong. I can't say whether or not his game sense is good or not, and I don't think he communicates very much, if at all, but I could be wrong about that because I don't really get him on my team that much. But just off of his mechanics alone, and generally his characters being high value and him playing them quite well, I think he can make A tier. Next up is Igez, and mechanically not actually that bad of a player, but his game sense is not very good, and he's a very big one trick for Fuchsia. That fact alone is going to restrict him from the A tier and place him right next to Cozy as a player that would be better if they weren't a one trick just based off their mechanics. Both of these players are honestly really similar. They lack game sense and they're very selfish, but they're strong mechanically. So B tier. Next up, 4-star Gotcha. I think mostly a duelist player. I don't think they communicate very much, and they don't play their characters particularly well, but also not particularly poorly. I think they're just decent mechanically, decent game sense, but lacks a lot of communication. Potentially, if they had more communication, then they could make the A tier, but as is, I'm gonna go B tier. Fuchsia, my goat. Unfortunately, not exactly present in the game for a while, but I think this, obviously I'm biased because this is my friend, but I think this is one of the strongest mechanical players in the game and one of the smartest players in regards to game sense. On top of that, they play a very wide roster of characters and they communicate very effectively. I'm going to have to go S. Most people are probably going to disagree with this. That's fine. Again, this is based off my experience, and obviously this is bias. But if I compare a player like him to pretty much anybody in B tier or in A tier, sorry, I think it is not even close. So that is my ranking. If you disagree, the link to this tier maker will be in the description. Feel free to make your own. Next up is Solo, and this one I think is going to be quite controversial. A lot of people think he is a good player, but me personally, I do not see him perform very well, and I almost always see him pick very, very selfish characters. I do think he communicates a little bit, so he does have that going for him, but I don't think he comes anywhere close to the A tier and is really a rough B tier. He could be a stronger player if he played more characters and didn't pick quite so selfishly. But he's similar to a player like Igez or Cozy, but Solo is just much weaker mechanically than either of those, in my opinion. So he's gonna have to at least sit in the B tier. Next up is Tux Hood. I think they pretty exclusively play DMR, and they're not the best mechanically. I don't think they communicate at all, and I can't exactly say their game sense has impressed me. This is going to pad out our C tier, unfortunately. I think if they improve their mechanics, they could make the B tier, but as is, it's going to be C. Next up is Stripes. This person has quit the game and come back, I think, like 17 times. They're pretty decent. They mostly play duelist, to my understanding. They're not the most impressive mechanically, but they're definitely not the worst. I can't really say I would put them above a player like Vi, though, so they're also going to be joining the C tier. I do think they communicate slightly, which is worth mentioning. Next up is Wubs, and of course I'm going to be very biased about this one because he's a big friend of mine. However, I think by my own criteria, he has pretty full marks in almost all categories. I think he's very strong mechanically. He's somewhat similar to Plushie in that he has very good mechanics in regards to Strinova itself, such as movement and weapon handling. But his aim probably isn't quite as good as anybody in S tier. That being said, he is also an incredibly versatile player, and he's very good at his main role of duelist, and he also communicates. So, in my opinion, and again, the link is below if you would like to make your own list and put all of Monarch Stack in F tier, but in my opinion, he easily makes A tier, and in time could definitely make the S tier as well. Next up, Nethi. Kind of a weird player to rank. He somewhat one tricks. I think he's been doing it less lately. His game sense, I really don't know if it's anything to write home about. I think he doesn't really communicate as much as he used to, but I could be wrong. Regardless, I think his character selection and the level at which he plays his characters is definitely going to knock him down a bit. Probably going to have to put him in B tier. That being said, he definitely picks characters that are more beneficial to your team than a lot of people in B tier, such as Cozy or Igez. So how beneficial of a player he will be to have on your team kind of depends on what you yourself play. And that's another important bit of context for this list in general, as this is all based off of my experience. A lot of it is going to be skewed based on what I was playing when I was playing with these players. So if a player is really strong on a certain character, and for instance, somebody else on the team or I on the team insta lock that character from them, that might put them down a level. Just keep these things in mind that it's based on my experience, and there's a lot of variables that could skew my experience and thus skew my opinion of these players. Next up is Zafkiel. I think they exclusively play Duelist from what I've seen. Mechanically, quite decent, but they never communicate in my experience, so it's definitely going to prevent them from encroaching on that S tier. I think they can definitely make A tier based off their mechanics alone, and they're quite a bit more flexible than a player like Cozy, although not as mechanically strong, but that flexibility just matters so much when you are deciding who is a better teammate. And now that I look at things, I'm probably going to have to move FS up to S tier because he is definitely just way stronger mechanically than most players down here, on top of being very flexible. So we will make that adjustment. The only thing I'm not certain of is whether or not he communicates a lot. So this could go down depending on whether or not that's the case. Next up is Cove V. Definitely going to be lower on the list because of their mechanics. I don't think they communicate at all, but they do pick relatively decent characters. However, I don't think they play them at a particularly high level. I definitely think they would bring less to your team than somebody like Vi. So unfortunately, it's going to be D tier. Xinhui Enjoyer, another original content creator for this game. Decent game sense, not the strongest mechanically, but definitely not the worst. Very flexible in their character picks, and they definitely do communicate. So all around, solid player, just held back a bit by their mechanics in my opinion, which keeps them from the A tier. I think if they were stronger mechanically or played their characters just that bit better, then they could make A tier. Next up is Welt Yang. They play a very weird soup of characters. They play some selfish picks like Mara and Fuchsia, as well as DMR, I believe. They're very weak mechanically, and their game sense leads them to get punished very frequently. Definitely going to have to put them pretty far down here, probably in the same tier as Kovda, potentially even lower, simply because when they are on a character like Mara or Fuchsia, they are really, really hurting you. Next up is Alusha. I think they pretty much exclusively play sniper. Maybe they've played support a little bit here and there, but they're quite decent mechanically. Definitely better mechanically than a player like Dr. Putis, so pretty simple. A tier, I believe. I don't know if they communicate much. Maybe not, but based off the mechanics alone, I think they can be A tier. McCoy is kind of a hard player to place because I don't really know what he plays. I think he plays a lot of shotgun primarily, and unfortunately, those are what I would deem to be selfish characters. I do believe he can flex outside of those, but I don't know exactly how well he plays those flexes. Mechanically, he's okay. I think his game sense is pretty decent, and he does communicate. I would probably place him above some of these people in B, but I don't know if I would place him quite as high as some of these people in A or even mid A. So I'm gonna say like a low A because I do think he's better than a player like Dark Knight 9, who is also a big shotgun player. So we'll justify it that way. But this could be a bit of a burger placement. I'm not sure. Next up is Guilt. When trading aside, I think he's a very weak player, very weak mechanically, very weak game sense. He does communicate, I will give him that. So for that fact alone, I'll probably put him above or above players like Gaia and Welt. And he does play a decent amount of characters, so that's another good justification for this. I don't think he's F tier, but he's very weak mechanically, and his game sense is also quite poor. So D tier. Next up is Gengu. It's another player that most people will need no explanation about. He is one of the strongest players in the game mechanically. He's quite flexible. He doesn't always communicate, definitely not as much as Sangura, I would say. But, I mean, you can't really get too mad at the guy. He's really strong mechanically, and his game sense is pretty good as well. Next up is Falcon. Unfortunately, another one-trick kind of player. Also my friend, but the bias will not save him from the docking of the one tricks. That being said, he's very strong mechanically. I don't know if he has the best aim, but he's very good at the mechanics of Strinova, again, similar to Plushie or Webs, where they have great movement and weapon handling. I think Falcon's game sense is kind of coin flip, where sometimes he is very, very smart, other times he makes some very, very bold plays, and unfortunately he is mute and never calms, so I'm going to have to keep him away from top of A, but he's definitely very strong mechanically, and if he were to branch out and be a more versatile player, he could definitely be much higher. Next up is Faker. I don't know if this person has another username that they go by. I only know them as Faker. I haven't seen them in ranked in a while, but I know they were a pretty big odd tree player, but not exactly a one trick. Pretty strong mechanically from what I recall. I can't comment on their game sense, and I don't know if they communicate. I feel like I've heard them open their mic a few times, but I'm not too sure, so I'll just operate under the assumption that they don't communicate. That being said, they're definitely very strong mechanically, and they're not quite a one trick such as Cozy or Igez, and I think they can make A tier off of that. Next up is Andercito007. People are really glazing this guy lately, calling him Sangura, but Hispanic, I think. I can see where it comes from because he sometimes has very, very strong mechanics and will shut you down in fights, but he's very inconsistent. So I won't give him as much credit for the mechanics, but I could be wrong. Maybe I've just, only seen him when he's having off games or something. But having said that, he is a pretty versatile player and he doesn't pick very selfishly. Usually I see him playing controller characters, and those are always pretty welcome on the team. However, I don't think he communicates at all, which is definitely going to keep him further away from S tier as well. And even then, I don't know if his mechanics justify him being an A tier. I could be wrong. Maybe I've just not seen what everybody else seems to be seeing, but I'm going to go with B tier, but definitely a high B, although his game sense might be a hindrance for him. Next up is Mitsuhaya Mano. This player definitely struggles most from having poor mechanics, especially because they are a duelist main. I don't think they exclusively play duelists. I think they can play other stuff, but they mostly play duelists as of late, and they also don't communicate at all. On top of that, I don't think they have the best game sense, and it's pretty apparent when you're playing with them. However, while they do not communicate verbally, they do try and work with the team some of the time, which is more than I can say for a lot of players in this game, so I might have to put them in C tier. And while I'm down here, I think I was probably a little bit too harsh on TQRD, given the other people surrounding him in that tier, so I will also bump him up to C tier. Next up is Yoryi, and this is going to be an unfortunate immediate F tier, and it is pretty similar to Gaia in the reasons why. Very, very selfish character picks, very much a one trick, never communicates, very poor game sense, and very poor mechanics. I don't want to hate on anybody, and I know that it can be very difficult and time consuming to learn and to improve mechanically, but as things stand, he is very, very weak mechanically, consistently performing toward the bottom of the leaderboard while playing very selfish characters, which leads him to be one of the worst teammates you can get on your team. Again, nothing personal. I don't have any problems with him. And even people on this list that I do have problems with, I am looking past that to try and rate them as objectively as I can. Next up is Dragon. I don't really see this player that much nowadays. They might be taking a break, or I could have just missed them. But they are another no communication player, I believe. I think they also mostly play Duelist. They're not the best mechanically. They're quite poor, but they're not the worst. And I think their game sense is also kind of poor. I'd say they're quite similar to Mitsuhaya Mano in a lot of ways. Definitely around the C tier. Not quite D, I wouldn't say, but yeah, nowhere near B tier, in my opinion. Next up is Masami322. This is a player that I actually think could be quite decent if they had better mechanics. I really like the characters they pick, and I think they play their characters pretty decent. Their game sense is another thing where they sort of just follow around the duelist and do their job, similar to Nasho. So I can't really rate their game sense, and they don't communicate at all, unfortunately. But I think if they were mechanically a stronger player, they could actually be quite a good asset to have on your team because they are pretty good at their characters, in my experience, and the characters they pick are very desirable. So for that reason, I will be putting them in the same tier as Nasho, who I think is another similar player who is really held back by their mechanics and also lack of communication. Next up is Marune or Maroon. I'm not sure how it's intended to be pronounced. Unfortunately, they're not strong mechanically. I don't think they communicate at all. and their game sense, it's definitely noticeably below a lot of the other players in something like B tier. That being said, I think their versatility will at least put them in the C tier because the characters they do play are pretty strong, and I don't think they're the worst at them. Next up is Lux, and I'm not talking about this player specifically here, but just because he is another sniper one trick, and there seems to be so many of those in this game, um, a message to all sniper run tricks here. This is a bit of a tangent, but please, sniper players, know your role. You are a support at the end of the day. The justification, the merit for having a sniper on your team is not because of the one-hit kill. It is because of the utility that they provide. So please, please play support first and foremost. That's it. Thank you very much. Moving on to actually rating this player, Lux is pretty decent. Sometimes he hits some shots, but most of the time he's pretty inconsistent. And I think he does communicate as well, similar to Dr. Putis. I think all around he's just a very similar player to Dr. Putis, maybe a little bit better mechanically, but I don't think mechanically strong enough to make the A tier. Next up is KRS Peak. He is almost exclusively a duelist player with a couple exceptions. I think Michelle and Audrey, maybe Chio as well. Unfortunately, he's very weak mechanically, which does not bode well for his character picks, and he doesn't have very strong game sense either. I think his mechanics are a bigger hindrance than his game sense, and he does communicate some, and sometimes it's not the kindest, like Fleshy, but again, that's not what this list about. I think it's very easy to place him very close to Stripes because I think they're pretty similar in their issues and strengths. Next up is Mr. Kirito 073. Unfortunately, he is also going to be joining the lower ranks here, and that is primarily due to his very weak mechanics. I think his game sense is also quite subpar. He is somewhat versatile, I believe. You know, he occasionally plays characters like Controller, but I think he also plays a lot of selfish characters, and so for that reason, he's going to end up kind of in the same place as Welt Yang, where if he picked selfish characters less, he might be slightly higher, but ultimately, both of these players are held back a lot by their mechanics, and to a somewhat lesser extent, but still pretty significantly, held back by their game sense. Yasi. I honestly don't know exactly what Yasi can or can't play. I think I see him most often playing Duelist, and I think he's just okay at it. I think he does communicate. His game sense is probably fine. I don't think it's necessarily great or necessarily terrible. He's probably going to end up in a very similar place to somebody like Koala the Bear. Next up is Resso, who I believe is a European player, so I don't have the best insight as to his ranking, but I do know he's a sniper one trick almost exclusively as far as I'm aware. However, his mechanics are decent and he can somewhat back it up. The only thing I'm not sure of is whether or not he plays selfishly on sniper, as I was, yapping about earlier. I think he could at least make B tier given his mechanics. Not sure if he communicates or not, but either way, probably not going to make the A tier simply because his mechanics are not on the same tier as somebody like Pooj or Takina. Next up is a complex. This is going to be one of our first higher placements in a while. He's very strong mechanically, and he can play quite a variety of characters pretty well. I do think he communicates some as well, so there's not much to complain about with this player. I think he can pretty comfortably make A tier, but definitely not S tier in my opinion. Next up is Lunar. I think he does play quite flexibly and communicates with his team, but he is held back quite a bit by his mechanics. That being said, I don't think his game sense is that bad, so I'll probably put him somewhere around here, similar to a player like Venikin. A suffers a lot from poor mechanics, even more so from very poor game sense and decision making, which is all the more problematic given he is a duelist-only player. He also never communicates with his team, so all these things in mind, he's going to have to go very, very low, below a player like Stripes or KRS, who are mechanically stronger, definitely are weak in game sense as well, but have stronger game sense and communicate with their team, whereas A does none of these things and is weaker in terms of mechanics and game sense. Moving on to J4YP3. I'm not sure if there is a proper pronunciation for this or not. I think he's a somewhat flexible player. I think he plays, characters like Law Wayne and other fill slots occasionally, but I think he also plays a lot of long range. I don't think he's the most impressive mechanically. I don't think he's the worst. I don't think he ever really performs that well, but never really performs terribly. And he can always make up for it with his character picks. That being said, I don't know if he communicates, but I will easily place him above anybody in D tier. Ikari Kira, I think mostly a sniper one trick, but maybe branches out a little bit here and there. They do communicate with their team. Their game sense is, decent enough. It's passable. Sometimes they'll make a good decision, but I don't think their mechanics can really justify them being too much further up the leaderboard than B tier. Runa Yan. I cannot pronounce the last part of that name for the life of me. They are pretty decent all around, decent mechanically. They're quite versatile, and they do communicate. Given all of that, I think I could at least place them around high B. I don't think they are quite strong enough to make A tier as of now, but I could see that happening in the future. Account 51, quite impressive mechanically. I can't say much for their game sense, but I definitely don't think it's a weakness of theirs. Pretty versatile, I would say. Plays a pretty decent variety of characters pretty well, and does communicate. I think they make the A tier pretty comfortably. Hashem, I think their mechanics are their biggest hindrance, with their game sense being something of an issue as well. They are somewhat flexible in their character picks, and they do communicate. I would say probably quite a bit better than players like Masami or Marune, but not quite making B tier in my opinion. Doxity, I'm not sure how to feel about this player because I feel like I don't see them very much. But from what I know, they used to be a sniper one trick who has since branched out a little bit. They do communicate, and their game sense isn't necessarily a huge hindrance. I think probably their biggest issue is their mechanics, but they do play very, very desirable characters, and they play them pretty decent. So for that alone, I think they can make A tier. Honk with 4Ks. This is a player that I see in ranked even less than the previous player. I'm not even sure if they're really active at all, but from what I know, they're pretty versatile, decent mechanically, but definitely not as impressive as a lot of the people around A tier. But they do communicate, and they have decent game sense. So I can pretty comfortably place them in A tier. Weeping, a bit of a hard one to place because he doesn't really play the game anymore, besides from the brief comeback here and there, to my knowledge. However, back in the day, he was one of the GOATs. Very strong mechanically, duelist main, game sense was nothing to scoff at, and he did communicate. Assuming he would get back on the grind and return to his former skill level, I think he'd easily make A tier, potentially rise to S if he kept at it. 580. Not going to spend too long on this. If you don't know about this guy, keep it that way. You don't want to know. All I'll tell you is he is very weak in pretty much any way you could imagine. So he will be going at the very bottom. Dave Kurim. I think they used to be a Celestia one trick, but nowadays I definitely see them filling a lot, which makes them a very versatile player, and I think they play most of their picks pretty well. They do communicate a lot. However, I think they're most held back by their mechanics. I think their game sense is fine, mostly just their mechanics that keeps them away from the A tier, but I think they very, very strongly fit into the B tier with how well they play their fill characters. Waffles, or Fox 1 Yukino. This is another similar case to Weeping, where they used to play. They've definitely weren't on the same kind of level as somebody like Weeping, but they were decent. Mostly a DMR player, although I think their mechanics would definitely place them quite a bit lower. I'll go bottom of A tier because I think they do communicate as well. Eepster. I think this person doesn't play very much ranked. From what I've seen, they're pretty flexible. They don't necessarily play their characters amazingly, but not horribly as well. Mechanically, not amazing, and they do communicate, I believe. So I think they could probably make somewhere around C, maybe low B, but I haven't seen them play enough to be sure, so I'll say C. T29 Hot Rod, a DMR main from the olden days. I don't think this player plays anymore, but they used to be quite strong mechanically, and their game sense was good too. And I do believe they also communicated, so I think they can comfortably at least sit in the A tier. And with that, I do believe my list is concluded. You're welcome to disagree. Some nuance I will add is that some of these players will go up or down a tier depending on the day. For instance, Welt Yang, I think he would go a little bit higher if he isn't on a selfish character, and some of these players might move up or down slightly depending on new information that I obtain, but as is, this is basically how I regard most of the Strinova community. If you have any notable placements that you disagree with, feel free to leave a comment and we can talk about it. Maybe you'll change my mind. If I got anybody wrong as far as their name or identity or anything, do feel free to point that out, and I will make a comment correcting it with my new rating. But other than that, yeah, all these players I'm just not familiar enough with to rank, and or they are simply duplicates of players up here. So I'll let you take a look with a slow scroll, and then I will leave you to your day. Bye bye.